picture's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with my second annual Besties and Worsties. This one, of course, of 2018. This was a big hit for me last year, so I'm doing it again. And of course I'm doing it tipsy. Tipsy is a euphemism. And I have many things to tell you about. Are you ready? But before I get into my list, I do want to have a chat with you. I have seen, to be honest, I haven't watched many of them because I'm just not all that interested in channel goals. I will watch your channel and I will see how your channel changes. But for me, for my channel, I'm not a big predictor of how things will evolve. If you've followed my channel for a while, you will have noticed this. I have moved away from new releases. I think that BookTube is heavily focused on new releases, and I don't particularly support that. There are some gems in new releases. I'm going to talk about a few of them tonight, but there are far more fabulous books that were published 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years ago than there will be that will be published in the coming year. So I have come to resist the pull of the newest thing, especially all the fucking stupid hype that goes with new releases. So I have amended some of my categories from last year so that I can include backlisted books. And going forward, I just don't really care as much as I did even a year ago about new releases. So let's get to the list, shall we? It's a mix of the good, the bad, and the ugly, as usual, with me. To the degree that my inebriated self will remember this, I'm going to alert you to any changes I've made to the categories, any additions or revisions compared to last year. And, as usual, I'm going to read to you a lot. My first award is for the best opening line or paragraph, and that goes to Akwaeke Emeze for her debut novel, Freshwater. Let me read you the opening. Chapter 1. The subtitle is We. The first time our mother came for us, we screamed. We were 3, and she was a snake, coiled up on the tile in the bathroom, waiting. But we had spent the last few years believing our body, thinking that our mother was someone different, a thin human with rouged cheekbones and large bottle-end glasses. And so we screamed. The demarcations are not that clear when you're new. There was a time before we had a body when it was still building itself, cell by cell, inside the thin woman, meticulously producing organs, making systems. We used to flit in and out to see how the fetus was doing, whistling through the water it floated in, and harmonizing with the songs the thin woman sang. Catholic hymns from her family, their bodies stored as ashes in the walls of a cathedral in Kuala Lumpur. It amused us to distort the chanting rhythm of the music, to twist it around the fetus till it kicked in glee. Sometimes we left the thin woman's body to float behind her and explore the house she kept, following her through the shell blue walls, watching her as she pressed dough into rounds, and chapatis bubbled under her hands. Freshwater by Akwaeke Emeze, one of my top reads of the year. The next category I have, carried over from last year, is the Sexiest Writing or Sexiest Scene. And hands down, that goes to Wendell Berry for his 2004 novel, Hannah Coulter. And this is not overtly sexual, but this passage throbbed in my body and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. This is a first-person novel narrated by Hannah Coulter, who's an old woman looking back on her life, and she is describing here her impressions of her second husband before she even so much as talk to him besides hello and how are you and good morning. But his best beauty was in his face, mostly in his eyes. From the time I was first aware of him, I never caught him sneaking a look. He looked at you with a look that was entirely direct, entirely clear. His look said, "Here I am, as I am, like it or not." There was no apology in his look and no plea, but there was purpose. When he began to look at me with purpose, I felt myself beginning to change. It was not a look a woman would want to look back at unless she was ready to take off her clothes. I was aware of that look a long time before I was ready to look back. I knew that when I did, I would be a goner. We both would be. We would be given over to a time that would be ours together, and we could not know what it would be. When I finally did look back at him, it was lovely beyond the telling of this world, and it was almost terrible. After that, we were going into the dark. We understood, and we were scared, and I wanted nothing more than to go into the dark with him. Yeah! That is the most erotic passage I read all year, if not for the last 15. Wow. All right, and this is a new category for 2018. The Unsexiest Writing or Scene. And this one, because it's such a booktube book, I'm just going to read it to you and then I'll tell you, all right? He pulled her face toward him and kissed her, caressing her breasts over the thin material of her nightdress. Her soft tongue curled. He removed the clothing that covered her body, and his bare hand touched the mound of her shy breast. He felt a hot wave wash over him from below. He grasped her close against him, and soon they were entangled, their hands searching each other's bodies in the dark. Victor caressed Jin's face, buried his nose in her breasts, and hugged her close to him as Jin arched her back. Victor's lips grazed her neck and bit her earlobe. Jin blushed, the earlier frosty melancholy. Jin blushed, the earlier... I'm trying, people! Jin blushed. The earlier frosty melancholy of her eyes melted away, her lips red. Their knees, as each lover tried to cover the other, bumped into each other. Not a single shade of dark thought existed between them in that moment. Well, I'm here to tell you that I had many dark thoughts as I read that piece of shit paragraph. Oh, by the way, that's from The Court Dancer by Kyung Suk Shin. I won't embarrass the translator by mentioning it. Next, the best cover. To be honest, I wasn't wowed by any of the covers in 2018, but I will give this award to a book from a couple years before that I read and that I tried to read and bailed on, but it did have a fabulous cover. It's a novel translated from the German called Before the Feast by Sasha Stanishik. And this cover was fabulous. Too bad about what was inside. My most extreme bail, at the 90% mark, I bailed on Tanya Tagak's Split Tooth. This was in large part due to her audio narration, which at the beginning I loved, and much of which I loved. And as I said in my review, Tanya Tagak, who is a noted Canadian Inuit throat singer, narrated the entire... I'm not sure if it's a novel or a collection of prose poems or a multimedia presentation, but whatever it is, I was mesmerized by so much of it. But unfortunately, I did it I started it on audio, I bought the book, and then I was doing it as an audio-text combo. One of the problems I had was that the audiobook arrangement of all of these little passages was different than in the text, the printed book, so that was difficult. But most of all, as much as I loved Tagak's audio narration for the shamanic and the really deep, profound passages, she never, ever varied her tone of voice, so that she had this breathy, shamanic tone of voice when she was talking about, and then I walked across the room and ate a potato chip. I mean, that worked really well for when she was saying, and then the polar bear stood up and asked me my name. But the same breathy intonation just didn't work for the really mundane parts of the book, and by the 90% mark, I was sick. The book that I wish I bailed on, without a doubt, that was Amélie Nothom's Fear and Trembling, a novella that I read and hate read in the late summer or something. It's one of her most famous novellas. It's my first by her. Jesus Christ. It's about some white woman in Japan working for a Japanese corporation, and I know about Japanese corporations. I know a bit. I live in Japan. I know a bit about the Japanese work world. I'm married to a salaryman, and I have taught in those places, and I understand it to a certain degree, and I think I understand it far better than Amélie Nothomb, who, depending on which place you check, her Wikipedia page or the biographical sketch on the back of the novel, was she born in Japan or not? But she grew up here for at least 10 minutes, and she wrote this novel about a young woman working in a Japanese corporation and employed every stereotype about Japanese culture that she could possibly find. And by the end, I hated her and I loved Japan even more. What an awful person the protagonist seemed, and to the degree that it was autobiographical, I would extend that to the author. All right, moving on. Something more positive. The next was my favorite character, and this is one of my favorite categories. And hands down, my favorite character of all the books that I read in 2018 was from the Victorian novel The Heir of Redcliffe by Charlotte Young, published in 1853. And it was the disabled character, a young man, I think he's a teenager when the novel opens, Charlie or Charles Edmonston. And at the beginning of the novel, it's a middle upper class family. It's not as rich as some of the other characters in the novel, and I don't care so much about class, so I always fumble everything when I'm trying to explain all that. But basically, middle upper class family, the Edmonstons, a delightful family, and their only son, Charles, has some kind of problem with his legs, so his mobility is severely restricted, and by the end of the novel he really can't walk, and he's using the equivalent of a wheelchair for what it would be in the early 19th century. And he is a rebellious, cantankerous character at the beginning of the novel, and I loved him immediately, but he does grow and change over the arc of the novel, and I think about him every day. So he is not the main character in terms of the romantic entanglements, but everybody loves him. The men in the novel want to help him. He asserts not only his independence, but his judgment of the other characters, and he modifies his judgment of the other characters, and he creates an independent path in his own life. And I just thought it was freaking brilliant and extremely moving. I loved Charles Edmonston. I've added a new category for 2018, and that is the most hated character. No, last year it was most loathed character. I've changed it to hated. I'm not sure why now in my inebriation, but now it's the most hated character. It's really a little premature to say typically, this is only the second time I've done the Besties and Worsties, but last year and this year I have chosen characters that other readers would typically like, but that I freaking hated. And this year's is from Jamie Quattro's 2018 novel, Fire Sermon. And that is the poet, James, who the protagonist has an extramarital affair with. And one of the reasons that I hated so much of this novel, and it's a little bit ridiculous that I gave this a 4-star rating despite how much of it I hated. I will link to my review. But one of the things that I hated without any ambivalence whatsoever was her lover. She was a married woman, and she met this poet James at some academic conference, which turned me off from the get-go. And they have this email thing, and he's so pedantic, and she falls in love with him, and it's like, no! He's an asshole! He's a pedantic asshole! Hated him. I would say a runner-up would be the character Bertram in the Elizabeth Taylor novel A View from the Harbor, which I bailed on a few weeks ago. I had read another novel by her, Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont, earlier this year, which is considered to be her masterpiece, which I loved. But Bertram was this retired captain who just plunked himself down in some seaside town in the UK and pushed his way into the lives of all of the women living in the town. Not sexually, but just obnoxiously and aggressively, and I freaking hated him, and I bailed on the novel mostly because of him. So that would be a runner-up. Man! Here's a new debut category for 2018, and that's the Pukeworthiest paragraph. Again, it's a popular novel this year, so I'm going to reveal all at the end. Was it her dark pupils? Her red lips? Her skin that was as bright as her eyes? Jin's face was a flower. Her eyebrows were as neat as lines, and the pupils nestled within her thick lashes were black and clear and deep. Her cheeks were pink, her fingers white and long, her breasts and hips full, her forehead flawless, her brow generous, and her wrists and ankles thin. Okay, wait for it. The foregoing was not so bad, but wait for this finale. The last three sentences are doozies. What should be dark was dark, and what should be red was red. What should be slim was slim, and what should be bright was bright. Where she should have curves, she had curves. What should be good writing was shitty. Courtesy of the court dancer by Kyung Suk Shin. Jeepers. Oh my god. I bailed 3 pages after that. Ba-dum, 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 ba-da, ba-ba-ba, ba-da, ba-da. All right, the next category is the best conclusion, and I am delighted to tell you that award goes to Joyce Carol Oates for her novella Blackwater, which was a buddy read with Britta Bowler. And this is a takeoff on the Chappaquiddick thing, so it's not a spoiler to say that the protagonist dies at the end. It's quite a long conclusion. I don't want to type all that tomorrow, so I would just randomly No, I'm going to give it to y'all. It's a beautiful conclusion. Spoiler, she dies at the end. He is the senator who was driving the car, who is loosely patterned after Senator Edward Kennedy. And yet, he was diving into the black water, diving to the car, his fingers outspread on the cracked windshield, and his hair lifting in tendrils. Kelly? Kelly? She saw him mute and astonished, and how many minutes, hours, had passed. How long had she been in this place? She could not know, for time would not move forward in this snug black corner, trapped in the twisted metal in the clamp that held her fast. But she saw him. There he was, suddenly above her, and swimming down to wrench open the door at last, the very door that had trapped her. And her heart swelled with joy and gratitude, dangerously close to bursting, as her eyes, too, strained from their sockets. She lifted her arms to him, giving herself up to him, so his strong fingers could close about her wrists and haul her up out of the black water at last. At last, rising together, soaring suddenly, so very easily weightless to the surface of the water, and she slipped free of his hands like a defiant child eager to swim by herself. Now she was free, kick-paddling with enormous relief, her numbed legs restored to her, as after a bad dream, and with strong, rhythmic strokes of her arms in the Australian crawl she'd been taught at school, she bore herself triumphantly to the air above, at last. At last! Her dilated eyes, seeing the splendid night sky restored to her again, as if it had never been gone. And the moon, gigantic, so shrewdly she thought, if I can see it, I am still alive. And that simple realization filled her with a great serene happiness, seeing, too, Mummy and Daddy waiting amid the tall grasses, though she was puzzled that now they were not young, in fact, but old, older than she knew, their faces haggard with grief, staring in horror as if they had never seen her before in their lives. Kelly, little Elizabeth, as if they did not recognize her running there, squealing in expectation, in joy, in her little white anklet socks, raising her arms to be lifted high, kicking in the air, as the black water filled her lungs. And she died. Wow. The next category is my favorite short story. To be honest, I didn't read as many short stories this year as I typically do and as I would have liked, but I give this award to a story from Ramona Asobal's collection, A Guide to Being Born, and the story is called Savor. You will be hearing a little bit more about this later on in this video. Stay tuned. So here is a book that I finished on December 31st, 2017, which I am including in this video because of my comments at the beginning, which is you can't properly assess a work of fiction so close to the end of the year. So what do you think about me doing my Besties and Worsties of 2019 in about July of 2020? Please give me your thoughts. However, I'm including this for the next award, which is my favorite conclusion to a short story. And that is from the title story called The Alphabet. This is a trib, a collection of stories by Ellie Williams. As I say, the dictionary seems smaller in my hands, but somehow grows heavier even as my speech bubbles grow thinner and more gauzy above my head. I want to be able to tell you that the petals are as light-heavy as full stops. I want to be able to tell you that I miss you, and the way you had with me, and the way you had with all the words that, at the time, I had for you. Oh, this is such a beautiful collection. I think she's coming up with a novel next year. This year. Maybe this year. Next is the award for the most surprising bail, and that, hands down, is Virginia Woolf's The Wave, which I attempted in December of 2018, and I was so burnt out from all the novellas and nonfiction I had read in November that I just couldn't get my head around it. Oh, I bailed about 35 or 40% in, despite having read it 25 or 30 years ago and absolutely loving it. So I was surprised.